They say extreme grief makes you hallucinate. For 4 years, I believed that. Convinced the man I loved was reduced to ash in the freezing mountains. I sacrificed my life to protect his legacy. But today, a child's innocent words tore down their perfect lie. I am not crazy. The real lunatics will be sitting front row at my wedding tomorrow, completely unaware their bride just returned from the dead to execute their empire. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. As many of you know, YouTube recently disabled our monetization, leaving us with zero budget to keep this channel running. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you will find exclusive, true stories that are even better, significantly longer, and filled with detailed situations we simply cannot share publicly on YouTube, all performed by multiple emotional voice actors in a single story. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the Patreon link in the video description or pinned comment. Now, let us begin today's story, told from the perspective of Alice Owens. For 4 years, the name Alice Owens, the 32-year-old CEO of Ethelgard Developments, was synonymous with ruthless efficiency in the corporate world. But behind the closed doors of my penthouse, I was nothing more than a ghost haunting my own life. It had been exactly 4 years since the private jet carrying my fiancé, Julian Vance, went down in the frozen, unforgiving peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The rescue teams never found his body. They brought back only scorched metal and a heavy silence that had deafened me ever since. Taking over Ethelgard was never my personal ambition, but it was Julian's lifeblood. I bled for that company. I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my sanity to keep his vision alive. Yet, recently, the walls had started closing in on me. A series of highly sophisticated financial disasters had backed Ethelgard into a corner. We were hemorrhaging millions of dollars, and the predators were circling closely. The worst of them sat right at my dining table. Victoria, Julian's mother, and Marcus, his ambitious cousin, wore masks of deepest sympathy while slowly dripping poison into my mind. They were relentless. Every missed meeting, every misplaced file, every moment of fatigue was weaponized against me. Victoria would hold my hand in the boardroom, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern while the executives watched. She would tell them, and me, that the severe trauma had fractured my mind. She and Marcus conspired to convince the board of directors, and eventually almost convinced me, that my deep depression was causing severe temporary memory loss. They would intentionally move important items on my desk, delete emails I swore I had sent, and then look at me with absolute pity when I panicked. They made me believe I was going completely insane, that I was simply too unstable to run the empire Julian had built. I was drowning in an ocean of self-doubt, and they were the ones holding my head firmly under the water. To save his legacy, I made a deal with the devil. I finally broke down and agreed to marry Nolan Price, a ruthless rival real estate tycoon. To the public and the press, our wedding tomorrow was branded as a massive strategic alliance, a corporate merger disguised as romance to crush the nasty bankruptcy rumors. In reality, it was a total surrender. I was handing over Ethelgard just to keep it breathing, signing away my freedom for a phantom. Today, exactly 1 day before I walked down the aisle to bind myself to a man I despised, I drove up to the Vance family cemetery. The Denver sky was a bruised gray, weeping a cold, steady drizzle. I needed to say one final goodbye. Julian's grave was just a cold stone over an empty casket, burying only his favorite books and a few untouched suits. I knelt on the wet grass, the cold seeping right through my jeans, and took out a soft cloth to wipe the rain off his engraved portrait. I stared deeply into his eyes, begging for forgiveness. Forgiveness for failing him. Forgiveness for giving up. The sudden sound of bicycle tires crushing the wet gravel broke the heavy silence. I did not turn around at first, assuming it was just the groundskeeper's child playing nearby, but the wheels stopped right behind me. I felt the undeniable weight of a gaze on my back. I turned my head slowly, A little boy, perhaps 8 years old, was straddling his rusted bicycle. He was wearing a bright yellow raincoat, his eyes fixed intensely on the marble headstone. He looked at the picture of Julian, then looked straight at me. "Miss," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the falling rain, "this man is not dead." My hand froze entirely on the cold marble. I stared at the boy, my heart doing a painful, staggering lurch in my chest. I tried to find my voice, thinking this was just a cruel child playing a morbid game. "He is at my house," the boy continued, his eyes wide and startlingly earnest. "He shakes every day." The air vanished from my lungs. The psychological torment Victoria and Marcus had put me through over the last few months flared up instantly. Was this it? Was I finally hallucinating? Was my shattered mind conjuring a child to speak my deepest, most desperate delusions out loud? "What did you say?" I choked out, my voice trembling uncontrollably. "He is always cold," the boy said, completely ignoring my question. He pointed a small, dirty finger directly at the photograph. "And he has a scar right here, like a half moon." The boy touched his own left wrist to demonstrate. The world around me stopped spinning. It crashed, a crescent-shaped scar. Julian got that exact scar when we were teenagers, falling off a rusted wire fence. It was something no journalist, no corporate rival, no stranger could possibly know. It was never included in any medical file released to the press. "And his watch?" the boy added casually, adjusting his grip on the wet handlebars. "It has words on the back, 'Forever yours.' He drops it a lot because his hands do not stop shaking." My blood turned to absolute ice. The silver watch, the secret engraving I had personally ordered for his 28th birthday, the watch he was wearing the very day he boarded that doomed flight, a watch that was never recovered from the crash site. I was not crazy. The grief had not broken my mind. I stared at this little messenger in the yellow raincoat, realizing that the corporate predators I was about to surrender to tomorrow had not just defeated me, they had orchestrated my destruction. And suddenly, the suffocating fog of depression I had lived in for 4 years burned away completely, replaced by something entirely different, a terrifying, crystal-clear rage. I forced my lungs to draw in the freezing air, pushing down the absolute hysteria that threatened to consume me. I slowly lowered myself to the eye level of the young boy, making sure my trembling hands were visible and entirely non-threatening. "Sweetheart," I kept my voice as soft and steady as the falling rain. "Where do you live?" He blinked, pointing a small, muddy finger toward the western foothills. "Out by the old logging roads. My uncle takes care of a big wooden house out there. It is hidden deep in the tall pine trees. The shaking man lives in the basement room." I asked him for the exact landmarks, burning every twisted oak tree, every broken fence post, and every dirt fork in the road he described into my memory. I thanked him, pressing a $50 bill into his small hand to buy some candy, and watched him pedal away into the gray mist. My mind was no longer a fractured, fragile mirror. It was a loaded weapon. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was supposed to be standing on a silk pedestal in a luxurious downtown boutique, letting expensive tailors adjust the hem of my custom white wedding gown. Instead, I was sitting inside my car on a deserted side street, staring at my flashing phone on the passenger seat. Marcus, he was calling me again. He always called when my schedule varied by even 15 minutes. The board of directors had insisted I keep the location tracking active on my phone for my own personal safety. It was never for my safety. It was a digital leash designed to monitor my every move. I grabbed the phone, powered it off entirely, and tossed it deep into the nearest heavy metal trash can. I drove to a cash-only rental lot on the extreme outskirts of the city and traded a thick stack of $100 bills for an unmarked, battered black sedan. I drove toward the foothills as the sun began to sink below the horizon, the gleaming Denver skyline shrinking rapidly in my rearview mirror. The darkness in the mountains did not just fall, it swallowed the world whole. I parked the rental car exactly 2 miles away from the location the boy had described. hiding it meticulously behind a thick, overgrown grove of pine trees. I walked the rest of the way on foot. The air grew thinner and sharply colder, biting right through my thin designer jacket, but I did not feel the chill. My senses were hyper-tuned. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot echoing in the valley. Every sudden gust of wind felt like a direct warning. After an hour of navigating the dense, unforgiving woods, I finally saw it. A massive, isolated log cabin sitting in a deep, unnatural clearing. There were no lights on the main floor. The only illumination came from a single, barred window near the muddy ground. But what stopped me dead in my tracks were the dark shadows moving slowly around the perimeter. Two men. They had broad shoulders, heavy tactical vests, and the unmistakable metallic gleam of suppressed rifles strapped tightly to their chests. This was not a secluded medical retreat. This was a highly secured black site. I dropped flat to my stomach, crawling silently through the damp mud and rotting autumn leaves. I ignored the sharp rocks tearing fiercely at the palms of my hands. I inched my way toward that single illuminated basement window, holding my breath until my lungs burned with agony. I pressed my face against the cold, dirty glass and peered through a tiny gap in the heavy blackout curtains. The room was bathed in a sickly fluorescent hum. In the center of the bare concrete floor sat a single worn armchair, and there he was, Julian, the man I had violently mourned for over 1,400 days. He was alive. The sight of him nearly ripped a blood-curdling scream from my throat. He was a hollow, broken shell of the vibrant, commanding man I loved. His collarbones jutted out sharply against his pale, translucent skin. His head hung incredibly low, swaying in a rhythmic, unnatural motion. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the blank concrete wall, completely devoid of any light, intelligence, or recognition. They were keeping him in a constant, chemical twilight, pumping his veins full of heavy sedatives to ensure he remained a docile prisoner trapped inside his own mind. The heavy metal door inside the basement room suddenly swung open. A tall man walked in carrying a plastic tray of cheap food. I pressed my hand hard over my mouth to stifle my gasp, biting down on my own finger until I tasted copper. I knew that man. I recognized the sharp, cruel jawline and the distinct tribal tattoo creeping up the side of his neck. It was Silas, the ruthless head of security for Nolan Price, my fiancé, the very man who was going to slip a diamond wedding ring onto my finger in less than 24 hours. The truth hit me with the devastating force of a freight train. This was not just Victoria and Marcus pulling the strings from the shadows. Nolan was the grand architect. They had all conspired together to bury Julian alive, methodically break my sanity, and steal Ethelgard developments from right under my nose. My first instinct was entirely feral. I wanted to smash the glass, tear through the iron bars with my bare hands, and drag the love of my life out of that concrete hell. But the armed guards pacing exactly 20 feet above my head meant one wrong move would get both of us instantly killed. A dead CEO could not save a broken king. I had to leave him there in the dark for one more agonizing night. I choked back a violent sob, the hot tears mixing with the freezing mud on my face, and slowly backed away from the glass window. I crawled backward into the tree line, retreating silently into the pitch-black forest, as I hiked the 2 miles back to my hidden rental car. The shattered, grieving woman I had been for 4 years died permanently in those woods. In her place, something cold, calculating, and unforgiving was born. Tomorrow was my wedding day, and it was going to be a masterpiece of absolute destruction. By 1 o'clock in the morning, I had abandoned the muddy woods and stood in the silent, echoing underground parking garage of the Ethelgard Developments headquarters. The building was heavily guarded, but I was still the chief executive officer. I knew every blind spot in the security camera system. I bypassed the main elevators and climbed the emergency stairwell to the 42nd floor, slipping undetected into Julian's old executive suite. It had been preserved exactly as he left it, a morbid museum exhibit carefully maintained by Victoria to fuel my constant, paralyzing grief. I locked the heavy mahogany doors and walked straight to the massive oak bookshelf. Julian had always been a man of extreme caution. 5 years ago, during a late-night strategy session, he had whispered a sequence of words into my ear, claiming it was a strict insurance policy if the corporate sharks ever backed him into a corner. I reached behind a leather-bound copy of an old architectural encyclopedia and pressed a concealed biometric scanner. A small, hidden panel slid open, revealing an offline terminal directly hardwired into a ghost server. I typed in the sequence. The screen illuminated the dark room with a harsh blue glow. What I found meticulously documented in those encrypted folders was an absolute masterclass in corporate treason. 4 years ago, Julian had not been preparing for a standard quarterly audit. He had been quietly investigating his own blood. I scrolled through hundreds of offshore bank statements, dummy invoices, and shell company registries. Over a period of 18 months, Victoria and Marcus had systematically embezzled tens of millions of dollars from Ethelgard. They had funneled every single penny into a complex web of ghost corporations entirely owned by Nolan Price. Julian had gathered enough concrete evidence to send his own mother and cousin to federal prison for decades. He was planning to hand the files over to the authorities the very Monday after he returned from his trip to the mountains. But he never made it back. The final folder contained something else, something Julian's ghost server had automatically intercepted and archived from Marcus's private email accounts in the days immediately following the plane crash. I read through the decrypted messages, and the entire twisted puzzle finally locked into place. The crash was never an accident. Marcus had paid an aviation mechanic an absolute fortune to sabotage the hydraulic lines of the private jet, but the execution was flawed. Julian survived the horrific impact, though he was critically injured and suffering from severe traumatic amnesia. When the private salvage team, hired secretly by Victoria, found him wandering the freezing wreckage before the official rescue units arrived, they did not take him to a hospital. Victoria realized that a dead Julian would trigger a massive federal investigation into the company's finances, exposing their theft. But a captive, brain-damaged Julian was the perfect leverage. She chose to keep her own son alive, locking him in that secluded cabin, pumping his veins full of heavy narcotics to keep his shattered memory from healing. And I was the final pawn in their sick chess game. The board of directors trusted me. The shareholders loved me. By forcing me into the seat of the chief executive officer, they stabilized the plunging stock prices. Then, they began their psychological warfare, gaslighting me for 4 grueling years until I was so broken, so desperately exhausted, that I would willingly hand over the keys to the kingdom. Marrying Nolan Price was never a romantic victory for him. It was a hostile corporate takeover wrapped in white lace, designed to legally transfer my voting rights and bury their crimes forever. I downloaded every single transaction record, every forged signature, and every audio recording of their dirty deals onto a secure, encrypted flash drive. I could have walked straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation right then and there, but simply handing them over to the police felt entirely too merciful. They had stolen 4 years of my life. They had turned the man I loved into a heavily medicated ghost. I did not just want them arrested. I wanted to obliterate their reputations, their fortunes, and their pride in front of the entire American elite. I pulled out an untraceable burner phone I had purchased earlier that night. I accessed a secure, encrypted network and contacted a highly specialized private military contractor based out of Nevada, a black operations team renowned for extreme international hostage rescue. The commander answered on the first ring. I did not hesitate. "I have a zero-failure extraction mission in the Denver foothills," I said, my voice as cold as the rain outside. "You will face armed, hostile security. The target is a highly sedated male. I am wiring $2 million into your offshore account right now. You will get another $3 million the second he is safe." "Understood," the gruff voice replied. "What is our operational timeline?" I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. "You will breach the compound at exactly 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon," I ordered. Right when the priest asks if anyone objects to my marriage, when you have him secured, you will send a live video feed directly to my secure server. Do not fail me. I hung up the phone and crushed it under the heel of my boot. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the glittering lights of the sleeping city. Tomorrow, I would put on my beautiful white dress, I would smile for the flashing cameras, and I would completely burn their empire to the ground. The morning sun poured through the stained glass windows of the cathedral bridal suite, casting colorful, fractured patterns across the stone floor. My reflection in the full-length antique mirror showed a masterpiece of absolute submission. Layers of imported white silk cascaded around me, while a bodice encrusted with hundreds of tiny, flawless pearls acted like beautiful armor. The team of expensive stylists had spent the last 3 hours pinning up my hair and painting my face to hide my supposed exhaustion. To anyone else, I looked exactly like a radiant, blushing bride who had finally made peace with her tragic destiny. I looked like a woman who had surrendered 100% of her fight to the healing power of new love. But beneath the intricate twist of my blonde hair, completely invisible to the naked eye, sat a military-grade micro-earpiece. Alpha Team is in position. A static, sterile voice buzzed directly into my right ear. We have eyes on the target structure. 6 hostile guards identified on the perimeter, awaiting the final countdown. I did not reply. I merely adjusted a diamond hairpin and smiled softly at my own reflection. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Victoria floated into the room, followed closely by Marcus. They were dressed in impeccable, dark designer clothes, looking like royalty arriving to collect their hard-earned taxes. Victoria approached me with her arms outstretched, a sickly sweet smile plastered across her meticulously lifted face. "Oh, my sweet girl," Victoria cooed, placing her cold hands gently on my bare shoulders. "You look absolutely breathtaking. Julian would be so incredibly happy to see you finally moving on, finally finding peace today." The sheer audacity of her using his name almost made me snap her neck right then and there. Instead, I forced my eyes to well up with perfectly timed tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Victoria," I whispered softly, playing the role of the fragile, broken daughter perfectly. "I just want to do what is best for the company, for all of us." Marcus stepped forward, clearing his throat. He pulled a thick leather folder from inside his tailored suit jacket and placed it onto the vanity table in front of me. "We are so proud of your strength, Alice," Marcus said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "To make sure everything transitions smoothly after the ceremony, our lawyers need you to sign this prenuptial share transfer. It just legally solidifies the merger between Ethelgard and Nolan's holding company. A minor formality, really." It was not a minor formality. It was the final nail in my coffin. It was a document voluntarily surrendering my voting majority, effectively handing them total control of an empire worth billions of dollars. I picked up the heavy document, pretending to scan the complex legal jargon with exhausted, defeated eyes. I reached into my silk clutch and pulled out a sleek, silver fountain pen. It was the commemorative pen Julian had used to sign his very first major development contract. Victoria's eyes gleamed with greedy anticipation as I pressed the gold nib to the thick paper. I smiled warmly at her and signed my name on the dotted line. However, instead of executing my legally binding signature, the one registered with every bank and federal agency, I deliberately altered the loop of the letter A and completely skipped my middle initial. In the eyes of corporate law, the paper they were salivating over was now completely worthless. "There," I said, handing the folder back to Marcus. "It is done." Marcus practically snatched it from my hands, exchanging a triumphant, gloating look with Victoria. They had won. They believed they had finally broken the stubborn girl and stolen the crown. "We will let you have a moment to yourself," Victoria said, kissing my cheek with lips that felt like absolute ice. "We will see you at the altar, darling." The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind them, my earpiece crackled to life again. "Hostile shift change confirmed," the tactical commander reported. "We are moving into the blind spots. 5 minutes to breach." Before I could even process the adrenaline rushing through my veins, the door opened one last time. Nolan Price stepped into the suite. He looked sickeningly handsome in his custom black tuxedo, wearing the arrogant smirk of a man who believed he had just bought the entire world. He walked over, gently took my hands in his, and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. "You look stunning, my love," Nolan murmured, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Today, we conquer the city. The future is going to be incredibly bright for us." I looked up into the face of the man who had funded my torment, the man who paid armed mercenaries to keep my true love locked in a freezing concrete basement. I gave him the most loving, radiant smile I could possibly muster. "Yes, Nolan," I replied, my voice as smooth as silk. "You have absolutely no idea what the future holds for you." He patted my hand condescendingly and stepped out to take his place at the front of the church. He thought he was walking toward his grand coronation. He did not know I was simply counting down the minutes until I sent him straight to hell. The massive oak doors of the historic Denver Cathedral swung open, revealing a breathtaking spectacle of absolute opulence. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the vaulted stone ceilings, filling the cavernous space with a thick, intoxicating perfume. The pews were packed with over 500 of the most powerful people in the country: tech billionaires, real estate moguls, high-profile politicians, and elite media representatives all turned their heads to watch my grand entrance. A string quartet began playing a hauntingly beautiful classical piece, the notes echoing off the stained glass windows. I stepped forward, my silk gown gliding smoothly over the polished marble floor. I held my bouquet of white roses with a grip made of iron. To the hundreds of guests watching, I was the perfect picture of high society grace. They saw the beautiful, tragic widow finally stepping out of the shadows to merge two massive empires. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting comfortably inside a gilded cage. As I took my first slow steps down the long center aisle, I gave a nearly imperceptible nod to the tall man standing near the entrance. He was the head of my personal, private security detail, a team I had secretly hired and vetted entirely outside of the company network. He immediately signaled his men, in perfect, synchronized movements. 5 heavily armed men in sharp suits stepped quietly backward. They pulled the massive iron handles of the cathedral doors shut. The heavy metallic slam echoed like a thunderclap, followed by the definitive, heavy scrape of thick steel deadbolts sliding securely into place. They locked every single exit. No one was leaving this room. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead as I continued my slow march. I passed row after row of smiling, oblivious faces. I saw Marcus sitting in the second row, adjusting his expensive silk tie, a greedy smirk playing on his lips. Right in front of him sat Victoria, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the emotional mother perfectly for the flashing cameras of the press row. Finally, I reached the grand altar. Nolan stood waiting for me under a massive arch of white roses. He reached out and took my hand, his grip slightly too tight, a silent reminder of his supposed absolute dominance. We turned to face the elderly priest. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his booming voice amplified by the cathedral acoustics, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The priest continued reading the traditional vows. Speaking of love, honor, and lifelong devotion, every word felt like ash in my mouth. But I kept my face entirely impassive, in my right ear, hidden perfectly beneath my hair. The micro earpiece crackled with frantic, heavy gunfire. The Black Operations team was actively breaching the hidden basement in the woods. "Flashbang deployed," a rough voice barked into my ear. "Hostiles neutralized. We are breaching the primary reinforced door now." I squeezed Nolan's hand, smiling sweetly up at him. He smiled back, thoroughly enjoying his final moments of perceived victory. "If anyone here knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony," the priest announced, looking out over the massive crowd, "speak now or forever hold your peace." A heavy, polite silence fell over the cathedral. The string quartet paused, The guests held their collective breath. Nolan leaned in slightly, ready to claim his prize. "I object," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the total silence of the church like a freshly sharpened blade. The priest blinked in profound confusion. A soft ripple of nervous laughter rolled through the back rows, assuming it was some strange, inappropriate joke. Nolan's smug smile froze instantly on his face. He tightened his grip on my fingers, his eyes flashing with sudden, violent anger. "Alice," Nolan hissed under his breath, his voice laced with pure venom. "What in the hell are you doing? Stop this right now." I violently ripped my hand out of his grasp. I reached up, grabbed the delicate lace veil covering my face, and tore it completely off my head, throwing it onto the cold marble floor at his feet. "I said, I object," I repeated, my voice now echoing powerfully through the microphone pinned to the priest's robe. Before anyone could even gasp, the massive digital projection screens flanking the altar, which were supposed to play a beautiful montage of our fake romance, suddenly flashed violently. The soft romantic lighting vanished, replaced by the harsh, blinding white glare of scanned financial documents. The entire congregation gasped in unison. On the massive screens, 50 feet high, were the undeniable, heavily encrypted bank records Julian had died trying to protect. Millions of dollars systematically funneled from Ethelgard Developments into dozens of offshore shell companies. And right next to those wire transfers were the legal incorporation documents of those shell companies, bearing the unmistakable, bold signature of Nolan Price. "What is this?" Victoria shrieked from the front row, leaping to her feet, her perfect aristocratic mask shattering into a million pieces. "Turn those screens off immediately, guards." But the screens did not stop. They flipped to the next slide. It was a recorded audio file, a conversation between Marcus and the aviation mechanic, discussing the exact price required to sever the hydraulic lines of a private jet 4 years ago. The audio boomed through the cathedral sound system, loud and undeniably clear. The massive cathedral erupted into absolute chaos. Journalists in the back rows frantically pulled out their cameras and recording devices, capturing every single second of the spectacular destruction. Corporate executives began shouting, scrambling over the wooden pews in a desperate panic, only to find the heavy oak doors permanently bolted shut by my private security team. They were trapped inside the nightmare I had meticulously built for them. Nolan's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He realized exactly what was happening. His massive empire, his reputation, and his freedom were burning to the ground right in front of his eyes. "Take her!" Nolan roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. 3 of his personal bodyguards charged up the marble steps toward the altar, reaching into their jackets for their concealed weapons, but they never even made it past the first step. My elite security detail moved with terrifying speed. Before Nolan's men could even draw their firearms, they were tackled violently to the ground, pinned down with heavy boots on their necks and cold steel barrels pressed directly against their temples. Nolan stumbled backward, his chest heaving, looking frantically around the room as his absolute power dissolved into nothingness. Victoria was clutching her chest, screaming at Marcus to do something, while Marcus stood frozen in pure, pathetic terror, staring up at the giant screen showing his own signed order for murder. Right at that exact moment of beautiful, chaotic symphony, a sharp beep echoed in my hidden earpiece. "Command," the gruff voice reported, breathing heavily over the radio frequency. "The target is completely secure. I repeat, Julian Vance is alive and secure. We are currently airborne in the medical transport helicopter, en route to Denver General Hospital. Medical team is stabilizing him now." A warm, powerful wave of absolute triumph washed over my entire body. I stood tall on the altar, surrounded by the screaming elite and the flashing lights of 100 cameras. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with Nolan, Victoria, and Marcus. I looked at the 3 monsters who had destroyed my life, tortured my true love, and tried to steal my future. I did not offer them a single ounce of pity. I gave them a smile of pure, ruthless vengeance. The massive digital screens flickered one last time, cutting sharply away from the financial documents to a live, high-definition video feed. The chaotic shouting inside the cathedral died instantly, replaced by a stunned, breathless silence. On the giant screen was the brightly lit interior of a tactical medical helicopter. Sitting upright on the stretcher, wrapped tightly in a silver thermal blanket, was Julian. He was dangerously thin, his face pale and heavily lined with 4 years of relentless chemical torment, but his eyes were finally clear. He stared directly into the camera lens with absolute, burning clarity. "Victoria," Julian said, his voice rasping through the massive cathedral speakers, heavy with righteous, undeniable fury. "I am coming home." A blood-curdling scream ripped violently from Victoria's throat. Her legs gave out completely, and she collapsed onto the cold marble floor, clawing frantically at her perfectly styled hair. The flashbulbs of the press row blinded her as the pristine mask of the grieving, devoted mother was permanently shredded in front of the entire country. Seeing his aunt on the floor, Marcus spun around and sprinted desperately toward the eastern side door of the cathedral, but the exact moment his sweating hand touched the iron handle, the door burst open from the outside. A dozen heavily armed tactical police officers swarmed into the room. They slammed Marcus face first into the stone wall, the sharp click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing above the noise. I had sent the entire encrypted flash drive directly to the Denver chief of police 3 hours before the ceremony even began. Nolan lost whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. His massive empire, his billion-dollar future, and his freedom were completely gone. With a primal roar of absolute rage, he broke away from his stunned guards and lunged directly up the altar steps toward me, his fists clenched, ready to destroy the woman who had ruined him. I did not step back. I did not flinch. As he reached the top step, I smoothly reached down, unbuckled my heavy, diamond-encrusted stiletto heel, and swung it with every single ounce of strength I had left in my body. The sharp steel heel connected directly with his jaw. A sickening crack echoed through the priest's microphone. Nolan crumbled to the floor at my feet, groaning in absolute agony, a pool of dark blood forming on the white marble. "You have absolutely nothing left," I declared, my voice echoing over his pathetic, bleeding form. The chief of police strode confidently down the center aisle, his authoritative voice booming over the chaos. "Nolan Price, Victoria Vance, and Marcus Vance, you are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, aggravated money laundering, and massive corporate fraud." I reached back, grabbed the heavy, restrictive silk train of my wedding gown, and ripped it violently from the bodice, leaving the torn, useless fabric on the floor. I walked down the aisle barefoot. I walked proudly past Marcus, who was sobbing pathetically in his handcuffs. I walked past Victoria, who was screaming wildly as the officers dragged her away. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the cool, fresh Denver air, leaving the complete wreckage of their lives entirely behind me. Hours later, the Denver sky was painted in brilliant strokes of orange and purple as the sun finally set behind the Rocky Mountains. The hospital room was incredibly quiet, save for the steady, reassuring beep of the heart monitor. I walked slowly to the side of the bed and reached out, wrapping my fingers around Julian's frail, bruised hand. He turned his head slowly on the pillow, looking at me with absolute exhaustion, but also with overwhelming, undeniable love. A single tear slipped down my cheek and fell onto our joined hands. For the first time in 4 years, I was not crying out of pain or desperation. I was crying because the poison had been drained. The empire was finally clean, and my king had returned. The true future of Ethelgard Developments starts right now. Thank you so very much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. If you enjoyed the story today, please consider helping us keep this channel alive by joining our Patreon. There, you will find our absolute best, exclusive true stories that we cannot make public on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.